the Rust Foundation. I'm here to talk to you about starting a foundation, but I am going to take a little bit of an interesting approach because I love that Helen came earlier, because what I really want to focus on is the problems that I think Rust and to a certain extent open source have, and then why a foundation could be a solution and why maybe some foundations and current structures perhaps aren't. The classic catch that Kara said, not all solutions work for everyone, very true. This is the solution I happen to be excited about right now. But first, let's talk about problems. So as I said, I work at the Rust Foundation. Starting in the summer last year, the Rust core team kicked off some work to start building this. You know, during a global pandemic, why not speed run starting a nonprofit? There's nothing else to do. And so we created an independent nonprofit organization to help steward the Rust programming language. And we officially announced it in February, though we established it in December of 2020. I ran to open a bank account on Christmas Eve. I remember. So, but our slogan for the foundation is a new approach to sustaining and growing a large participatory open source ecosystem. And if anyone's seen a talk by me, you might expect that we're going to get a little philosophical. I'm going to go, so why does open source matter, right? And talk about growing a large participatory open source ecosystem. And when we talk about open source, we often talk about software freedom. And it's interesting. If you dig all the way back, this is kind of the definition of the 4 essential freedoms of software. I've never found these that compelling. I mean, whenever I've read them, I've always wondered, like, why don't I feel free? I assume at some point in history, someone was very moved by these freedoms. But these days, as an open source maintainer, I'm not. In fact, these freedoms feel almost like a burden. And so that's why I focus and added this extra word in here where we say participatory. And I think for a lot of people these days, open source is not just source available. Open source means something more participatory. And this is why I like to talk about the freedom to collaborate. And I think this is something that is particularly important for Rust, and the Rust community has really, I think, spearheaded new levels of like radical collaboration in how we do things. And this idea of the freedom to collaborate is something I'd like you to kind of think about as we talk about what foundations are and why you might want to start one. So I know I'm in the project health section, and I know there's a maintainer health section, and I didn't watch it. But for me, these are the same. Project health is maintainer health because the core of the project is that collaboration, and who facilitates that collaboration but maintainers. So for me, these two are one and the same. Your project is not healthy if your maintainers are not healthy. I also am a subscriber of, like, you know, your company's not healthy if your workers are not healthy. And if we talk about problem definitions, am I going to say capitalism is the problem? Maybe. But again, you showed up for an Ashley Williams talk, you're going to get one. These two mean the same to me. I'm sure there's ways to argue that they're different, but I don't think they are. So in the very first board meeting that we had of the Rust Foundation, I brought up this slide and I said, whenever the Rust Foundation board is doing something, we should always be asking ourselves, how does this help the maintainers of Rust? And if we are doing something and it does not help the maintainers of Rust, we should not be doing it. And this came from a lot of background I have in other foundations, but it was always something that I believed that a software foundation should be supporting the people who are building the software. And I quickly came to realize that that was not really the case. And so we very specifically set up the Rust Foundation to focus on this. And so this is a slide of the GitHub avatars of, I think, all of the Rust maintainers as of 2018, team members that I could grab. But it's much larger now. So a lot of being able to explain this perspective on open source and the importance of maintainers comes down to explaining a dichotomy that I think a lot of people have an intuition for, but I have not yet found a source where people officially define it, and I've just started doing so. If one exists, I'm happy to say that they came up with it. But I use the word maintainers and contributors very differently, and a lot of people kind of use them interchangeably, and I think the difference really matters. So the key thing for me is that maintainers make contributors possible. You can't have contributors without a maintainer. And so just to kind of give it some concrete terms, a contributor is somebody who's able to make a PR. And the maintainer is the person who reviews and merges that PR. And early on in a project, contributor and maintainer are often the same person. They're just one person on the project. But as a project scales and grows, these roles become incredibly distinct, and the overlap between who's a contributor and who's a maintainer gets lesser and lesser. You can think of it as a circle that slowly becomes a Venn diagram that splits apart. And this is because the work you need to do and the types of kind of engagement you need between a contributor and a maintainer are very, very different. And so in general, when we talk about Rust governance, Rust has a ton of teams, and the Rust team members, their roles are maintainers. They often will do contributor work, but almost in every case, their work is to be maintainers or facilitators of contributors. So when we talk about Rust governance, just very quickly, if you're unaware, Rust has really delegated and distributed governance. I'm a member of the core team, but the core team is not kind of like the dictator of the project in any capacity. Rust has 10 teams, core being one of them, and decision-making power for each kind of section that team represents is delegated to those teams. And of the 10 teams, and then we have kind of 54 project groups, we have 260 active members. And it's important to note that those are people who are doing largely that maintenance work I talked about, not that contributor work, which is very important to note. So Rust also has very participatory decision-making processes. We use a process called RFCs, and we have values like no new rationale, which means that when we make decisions, we have to make them all in the open, and they all need to be written down. And these numbers were actually ran in October last year, but as of October last year, we had 471 merged RFCs, and we had 1,128 people participate in those RFCs. So that's like a reasonably large company of people who are all participating in designing key things in Rust. And what's interesting about this is I think these types of numbers rival the types of numbers that you see at very large companies. I think if you asked how many people helped to design, you know, the Gmail interface or something, like you're going to be, it's going to rival some of these numbers, some of these decisions we've made. So I often like to joke that open source projects are, sometimes I say small companies, but Rust is a very large one. And what's interesting is we often overlook all that coordinated communication and management work that companies build in, but open source projects often don't. So if I was to talk to you today about what problem I want to solve, we want to solve, when we talk about the Rust Foundation, I would draw you this picture. This picture is the problem that I think open source foundations need to solve and currently do not. So on the y-axis here, you see number of people, and the x-axis is time. And you can take a look at the lines. One says commenters, then users, then contributors, and maintainers. So let's walk through this, right? So at the very beginning of a project, you know, you might have some commenters, you probably have a couple of contributors, probably a maintainer, and not really that many users, all right? Then over time, you know, you get some more attention, people paying attention, contributors spin up, maybe you get one or two more maintainers, but you start seeing users climb. At some point, your users start really climbing and you have more people using your product than, or your project than you have contributors. I feel like in retrospect, I can look back at all projects that I've worked on and know when this moment was. This is a moment that's often really painful. And things feel like they're on fire all the time. They're falling over. But it's also really exciting because it's supposed to be the moment of your like best success. Like you have made it, but you're trying to keep your head above water. And what you can see right after that moment is the maintainers start drifting off, but users and commenters continue to rise. I think that this is not a perfect diagram, but I have spoken with a lot of people about this and it is representative of a lot of people's experience. And I think that this is a really big problem that we don't currently have some great solutions for. So To get back to talking about maintainers, why are they so hard to find? Why are they so hard to grow? And part of that issue, I think, is that maintainer work requires high context and high consistency. You need to hold a ton of stuff in your head. You are coordinating across a lot of things. You're holding a lot of needs together, and you can throw tools at this as much as you want. And there's so many great tools. Like, ask me sometime about the literal ecology of bots we have running in the Rust project. It's fantastic. But ultimately, there are people who are holding context, and you can't get rid of that. And the maintainers are people who hold that context. And holding that context and being that consistent requires just physics of space and time that makes you need to be present a lot. And so the classic open source saying that if you have the misfortune to succeed, maintainership is a full-time job. There's always is a very sardonic joke that I have about octocats, and cats have 9 lives, but as an octocat, you don't live them linearly, you live them in parallel. One life is to make enough money to live, and then the other 8 are for open source. And it's very, very sad. There's if you end up building something awesome, you end up with a whole bunch of work. I currently have a project that's was super successful, and now it's just the most horrible drain, and there is no bandwidth to take care of it, and it's just slowly, painfully, visibly dying. It's horrible. But yeah, we don't want this to happen, and so we need new models to try and help fix this. So, and it's worth noting that particularly with the Rust project, or projects that aim to be better than the status quo of tech, which, I mean, everybody should be aiming to be better than that status quo, which is to say, the more participatory your project is, the more empowering it is, the higher quality of a contributor experience, the amount of that maintenance work that you have to do quadruples. It just grows exponentially. So if you're actually trying to do open source and trying to do it well, that makes the maintenance work even higher. And those are all things that Rust is aiming to do as a project. And as a result, Rust is really playing on hard mode. That's why we have 260 active people just doing that maintenance work, simply because our values and our standards are that high. But that requires a ton of work. So what are we supposed to do about this? This is a really complicated problem. It's not just supposed to be a complaint sesh. Or, I don't know, I think Kara said maybe this is a complaint sesh, but maybe I have some ideas. So the first one is that classic open source foundation. So open source foundations have existed for a while. But in general, and asking the question, why an open source foundation? Why do you have that? I don't think a lot of people ask that question a lot, and a lot of people don't really know the answer. But ultimately, with the folks that I have spoken to and the foundations I've participated in before, they're really focused on growing adoption, and then sometimes they're focused on growing contributors. And I don't know if you remember that graph I showed you, but ultimately, I think this is a really unbalanced system. To grow adoption and grow contributors is only going to hurt maintainers even more. So if we take a look at this, right, we see users, commenters, as those go up, we're still not moving the needle on the maintainers. And what I've been told by people at previous foundations is that, hey, if we get enough people using them, then like maybe some people will contribute some stuff back. And to me, that is not a valid solution. We need a better solution. So instead, what I'm hoping to focus on is needing to do what I call capturing adoption, which is taking that line of the commenters, the users, and using that gravity to kind of pull up the maintainers line by creating some economic models to help incentivize it. So this is kind of just a visualization. As our users go up, how can we also make maintainers go up? All right, so another graph. Again, number of people on the y-axis, time on the x-axis. So for number of people, top line is just people with ideas about your thing, which goes up real quick. But then over time, one of the things to call out is as you see corporate users grow, that is often one of the reasons you start seeing maintainers drop off. And part of the reason for that is that as you're gaining corporate use of your open source project, people are getting hired to use your open source project's technology, not to work on it. And if you're looking for someone who is really, really good at using that open source technology, the people who work on it are probably the best options, but they're going to brain drain your project of those people, because now that person's working with that technology and not on it. And so what I want to do is change that pattern. All right, that little X here, how can we make those go up together? So I think that we need to start seeing a huge influx of maintainership being a career opportunity. And I think it's really important that we not lose the plurality of companies that we can have involved. So I don't think being a maintainer should be a career opportunity at just one place. I want to see it happen at a lot of different places. I'd like to see little open source teams forming inside companies and then working together inside project governance. So these are the membership levels for the Rust Foundation currently, but these are not the super interesting numbers. These are. So one of the things we're doing, and we've based this model off of the Eclipse Foundation, which has a fascinating model similar to this, where we are trying to incentivize companies to employ team members full time to work on Rust open source. And in doing so, they would pay us less money. And the idea is it'd be great for you to give us money to the Rust Foundation, but it's more important for you to give that money to a team member. And part of that is because the Rust Foundation is never going to be able to pay every maintainer what they deserve, and they're not going to become a full-fledged HR department like that person deserves. And so how can we leverage companies that already have these to be able to make sure that our team members have great financial security and are able to still focus on their open source time? So I'm sure I'm over time. I hope I've given you something to think about. But at the Rust Foundation, we're really hoping to kind of approach sustaining and growing a large participatory open source ecosystem in a new way. And a lot of it really comes down to this freedom to collaborate. Remember, happy, healthy maintainers are people who are able to facilitate the best collaboration and the best participation. And I'd say right now, we don't have economic models that produce happy and healthy maintainers. And so when I think about Rust, like Rust is the emergent product of the people building Rust. So investing in Rust, giving money to the Rust Foundation, means investing in its people. There's no difference between investing in the technology and investing in its people. And collaboration is incredibly expensive. People are expensive. And honestly, in my opinion, they are really the only things worth investing in. So I've been saying this for years, but the dirty truth of open source is that somebody pays for it, right? And these costs are incredibly real, and they're almost always borne by those people generating the value and not companies and others who are benefiting from it. And I think the time has come for us to change that. So I often talk about this in terms of taking responsibility, and I really mean it. I think that we have been, existing in a system that's really unaccountable, and the work to do is to really figure out how to make the system more accountable. So I believe that the new job of software foundations is to highlight the cost of open source maintenance and also the value. Interestingly enough, I think we don't understand the cost, but I also don't think a lot of people understand the types of work that good maintenance can really cause. So, and I think most excitingly, I think the new job of software foundations is to build new economic models for maintainer growth and retention. I think that open source has made it. We don't have to worry about companies buying in. We're seeing companies buy into open source at breakneck speed. We do not need fancy events to make them adopt open source anymore. What we do need to do now is look back at our own house and figure out how we're going to make sure that we can take care of the people who are building the technology people are adopting. So again, investing in technology should always mean investing in people, but this is not a reality yet, but I really hope it can be. So time for some new types of software foundations. Thanks.
Wow. That was super powerful, Ashley. Thank you so much.
Yeah, indeed. Enjoyed every minute of it, and always love hearing what the Rust team is doing, what they're working on, because I feel like everything's thoughtful from that end.
We're trying. This is something I've been big mad about for a while,
At the end of Upstream yesterday, Josh Simmons was like, well, cool, we'll see everyone next year. But hopefully, we won't have the same conversations because we won't have made progress. We're talking about the same stuff next year. We won't have made progress. And I know next year is only a year away, but I hope.
I was going to say that we're going to have to change that geologic pace we're working on.
hope we'll see even a little bit of the shift that you're pushing for there in the next year.
We'll see.
Thanks, Ashley.
Head to GatherTown.
Yep.